Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you enjoyed that beginning of rendition of Tehillim Kuf Daled, Baruch Nafshi, Psalm 104. We'll return to it in a bit. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you, to be learning together with so many of you tonight. I recognize some faces. I know some of your faces, others I'm first meeting. So let me introduce myself. I'm Shira Hecht Koller. I'm a Jewish educator living in New York City, and I am the Director of Education for 929 English, the global Tanakh study project and platform. And we're so delighted tonight to be celebrating 100 days of Psalms, of Tehillim. Today's actually day 107, but we celebrated last week in the 929 3.5-year cycle of study. It's actually today is the 674th chapter out of the 929 chapters. We'll be ending the cycle in just about a year, February 2nd, 2022. And we're deeply honored and grateful to be sharing the learning and teaching together in celebration tonight with Project Zug, with Hadar, with Rabbi Shai held. Again, because this is a blended community, I'll introduce, most of you know him, but some new people might be here. Rabbi Shai Held's president, dean, and chair in Jewish thought at Hadar, where he also directs the Center for Jewish Leadership and Ideas. And tonight's learning together is a very special collaboration between two communities of learners, at 929 and at Hadar and Project Zug. This was conceived from the outset as a joint communal event in line with two cycles, with the Project Zug cycle of study, where Psalms were studied as part of that cycle, and the Tehillim Psalms cycle as part of the 929 cycle, which we started Tehillim we got to a few months ago. So just much gratitude tonight at the outset to Ali Khan Cantor, to Morty Labaton, to Bachi Weiler, at Hadar, to Josh Cantor, not related to Ali, at 929, and Skittish Media for all the help in orchestrating the learning tonight. For those of you who are not so familiar with either Project Zug or 929, you'll get the flavor and sense tonight as we teach together. We will obviously be happy to follow up with more information about both after our teaching. So with that, I'm going to turn over to the first half of our learning together of Tehillim Kuf Daled, Baruch Nafshi, Psalm 104. So Rabbi Shai held, my friend, colleague, and teacher in many ways, who will start our exploration together, and I will pick up from him in about half an hour. So with pleasure, Rav Shai.
Thank you so much, Shira, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm excited for this opportunity to learn together. Psalm 104 is a daunting task. It is a text that both requires and repays deep investigation. And given the time constraints that we have, I'm going to try to speak about it in very general ways, which is not my usual way of reading a text, but I think there's a lot we can get out of this text just by sort of talking about it and then by digging into a few verses in particular. I think that a good way to start in thinking about this is to recognize that there are two, or maybe at least two, ways in which Tanakh thinks about the relationship between humanity and the rest of creation. A modern German Bible scholar has argued that what we have is, on the one hand, the dominion model, which is associated, of course, with Breshit Aleph, the notion that human beings are, although definitely part of creation, appointed as God's vice-regents to rule the earth. But there is also, alongside the dominion model, an integration model, according to which human beings are more firmly entrenched and implanted as part of the created order as a whole. Psalm 104, Tehillim Kuf Daled, is a great example. It is perhaps the paradigmatic example of the integration model of the relationship between human beings and the rest of creation. What really animates this text is a kind of deep and pervasive sense of the world as God's gift to all of God's living creatures, all of whom crucially share a kind of elemental and irreducible dependence on God. What you see when you read this text is just how deeply all of creation depends on God for nourishment and sustenance. Human beings do get a little more attention than other living things in this text. So you see references to domesticated animals, to agriculture, to viticulture, to arboriculture, right? To ships that human beings send out into the ocean. But there is no hint in this text that human beings are supreme over the creatures in general, right? There is a way, I often think about a phrase from Abraham Joshua Heschel that's not quite appropriate to this psalm, but Heschel talks about how all of created beings live in a fellowship of praise. Here, what you have is a fellowship of creatureliness, right? We are all deeply indebted and dependent on God, and we are fellow creatures. If you share the text on the screen, you can see two examples of this that I think are really striking. First of all, verse 14 of the text, which says, right, Matzmiach chatzir labehema ve'esev lavodat adam. You make the grass grow for the cattle and herbage for man's labor. That is the direct parallel, human being as equal among equals. Grass for the cattle, herbs for the human being. And then in verse 21, you have the statement, Hakfirim shoagim lataref. The lions roar for prey, and they go out at night looking for their food, right? And then the sun rises, they come home, after which, verse 23, Yetze Adam lifa'olo ulavodato ade arev. The Bible scholar William Brown has this wonderful comment where he says, all that distinguishes the lion from the human is that the former takes the night shift while the latter works during the day, right? So you have these verses that I think very much feed into this understanding that we are all creatures, part of this web, this ecological web that God has created. Now, I'd like to just kind of walk us through, Bachi, if you could go back to the beginning of the text. I want to walk us through just a few highlights that together construct a theology out of this text. So beginning with the first verse where we say, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, right? Bless my whole being, bless God. Adonai Elohai, O Lord my God, gadalta me'od, you are so very great. And then the phrase, hod v'hadar lavashta, you are clothed in glory and grandeur. These terms, hod v'hadar, are the terms of royalty. And what is really striking here, I think, is the intimation or the suggestion that the parts of the natural world are, as it were, God's royal clothing. They are the trappings of royalty for God. An image worth thinking about. And then we hear in verse 2 something that I think is quite gorgeous. We hear that God spread the heavens like a tent cloth. Notesh shamayim kayiriyah. The word yiriyah, by far, the majority of the uses of yiriyah refer to the curtain of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle that the Israelites build in the desert. And you have to wonder whether the use of the word here suggests that God's house is ultimately not the temple, but the universe as a whole. If God is, after all, the sovereign over the whole universe, then the whole universe is God's home. Or if you prefer, this may be a different way of saying the same thing, I'm not sure. Perhaps the claim here is that the universe itself is God's temple, ultimately. On the one hand, God has a temple that is a temple, and on the other hand, at the same time, the whole universe is God's temple. Now, I want to draw your attention briefly to a scholarly debate about this chapter. If you turn to verse 6, you see a scholarly debate from verse 6 to verse 9, right? What you see on your screen right now. Is there a reference in these verses to God's defeat of chaos? As many of you know, creation in the Hebrew Bible is not primarily, or is not probably ever, God making something where there was nothing before, but rather God establishing order where before there was chaos. And one of the ways that God establishes order is by defeating the chaotic waters that are there at the beginning of creation. Okay? Now, here, what is striking is you can actually look at the English, just in the interest of time, is the statement that God made those waters. That statement leads many scholars to suggest that if there's any reference to the chaos here, it's muted, vestigial, it's not central to the text. Whereas other scholars insist, no, when we say min garat chayenusun, right, that they flee at your blast, at your thunder, makes the waters flee, that is a reference to the old cosmic battle whereby God establishes the world. I don't particularly honestly have a view on this, but I think what's striking here, and it is a vision of a God who is really in control of the world, is that these once chaotic waters will essentially become springs which nourish the world. Right? Chaos has been so reined in that now it provides, the source of chaos is now a source of nurturance and sustenance. Okay? Now, if we scroll down to verse 10, you see here the emergence of a world that is habitable, both for human beings and for animals. And as I just mentioned, verse 10 is a good the good instance of this. Instead of chaotic waters, you have here springs, springs that provide sustenance. Not only, in other words, is chaos tamed, right? It is harnessed, and its potentially destructive power is turned here into a vehicle for serving God's life-affirming purposes. Okay, so that's the kind of the dramatic shift. There's a kind of a picture here of, when I used the word before of ecology, I meant that quite literally. There's a kind of order and an ecological interweaving of creation here, that is this kind of perfect picture that we're presented with. And then the text moves on to talk about rain, which waters all of the stuff, if you will, that's growing on the earth and enables herding and feeding of the animals. Now, there's something I'd like to point you to in a minute in verse 13, Bachi, if you scroll up just a little, thanks, which is that I just want to draw your attention to the last two words in the Hebrew of verse 13, tisbah haaretz. The earth is sated from the fruit of your work. And this may be an overreading, I'm not sure, but it strikes me as significant here that the earth is described in the way that most of us associate humans. You should eat and be sated. Here, it is the earth that is sated. And in verse 16, it will be the trees that are sated. This is important, I think, because it is part of a larger thrust in this text, which is the refusal of any hint of anthropocentrism. Any idea that the world is created for humans, any idea that the world is centered on the human. Yes, it's true. Human beings are sovea, are sated, but so too is the earth, and so too are the trees. Now, in verse 15, I just want to show you, I think it's interesting. You have here a reference to how wine gladdens the heart, and oil and bread. Oil makes the face shine, and bread sustains human life. These are, as Adele Berlin and Mark Bretler pointed out to me, since I am so agriculturally weak and urban boy, the three main crops of the agricultural year: grain for bread in May and June, grapes for wine in August and September, and olives for oil in October. Wine is associated with pleasure, oil with luxury. All of this kind of elemental produce is made possible by water, which is put there by God. Interestingly, by the way, in the Ugaritic epic Kirta, now we're going into obscure land, but I think it's actually important for a minute. In the Ugaritic epic Kirta, drought is described as the absence of this trio of bread, wine, and oil. So God here is the one who creates the very opposite of drought, the very fullness of fullness, if you will. Okay? Also, just for a minute, let's scroll down to verse 16. I already talked about how Yisba'u Atzei Hashem, that the trees are sated, same root again. But I also find it interesting to think about what the phrase Atzei Hashem, God's trees, means. These trees are not just trees; they're not just the background music that I was taught about as a kid in yeshiva. They are God's trees. Nature is very much God's. Now, if you go to verse 19, you'll see there the statement that God is Asa Yareach Lamoadim Shemesh Yada Miva'o. May originally have been Shemesh Yida Miva'o. I'm not really sure. But so God made the moon. This is obviously a total demotion of the idea that the heavenly bodies are somehow deities. They are anything but deities, right? They simply serve a job. They do a job that God has given them. Okay? Now, let's take a pause for a minute and think about this. So far, the picture we've been given is of a world that is fairly perfect seeming. Everything is in harmony. Everything is set up in such a way that each creature can have its fill. And then in verse 21, something happens that might strike some modern readers as surprising in light of all that, which is that one animal eats another. God gives them food. This is in contrast, say, to Genesis 1 and to Isaiah 11. There is no lion lying down with lamb here. If anything, there is lion eating lamb. The psalm accepts, I think, that for now, the world is the way the world is. There is no fantasy here of animal vegetarianism. Lions eat other animals, and God is like the farmer who's providing them with other creatures to eat. The Bible scholar John Goldingay describes the God of these verses as like the keeper of a wildlife park, who drops animals into other animals' cages, if you will. There's a kind of acceptance here that the way of the world in this eon, at least, is that animals do eat each other. In verse 23, you see again this notion, in verse 21 to 23, you see again, just to refresh your memory about where we were, the lions go out at night, the people go out by day. And then all of this culminates in this kind of exclamation, Marabuma secha Hashem, kulam bechochma asita male'ah haaretz kinyanecha. I actually want to be pedantic and say I think the JPS translation could be sharper. Marabu ma'asecha is not how many are the things you have made, O Lord, but rather how manifold are the things you have made. Because the issue is the variety, I think, of what God has made, not the sheer quantity of it. So this is a kind of a summation, a summary of the poet's experience of looking and seeing everything he's looked at and seen so far. Now, it's not just that it's manifold, but it's also the manifestation of God's wisdom. Kulam bechochma asita. Here again, John Goldingay makes the observation, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure it's the only way to read the verse, but it's interesting that if wisdom has a particular connotation in the context of this psalm, he suggests it's the interwoven ecology that the psalm describes, right? This is quoting from him for a minute. The world is a magnificent quilt in which every thread contributes to the whole, woven by a supremely skilled craft worker. Kulam bechochma asita. You were the one who wove this magnificent quilt of life. Okay, we then get to the next kind of controversy, which I think is fascinating. Verse 26, if we scroll down just a drop, Hachi. We talk about the sea, and we hear, Sham oniyot yahalechun, there go the ships, Leviathan ze yatzarta l'sachek bo, Leviathan that you formed to play with. Now, some people want to read this as saying the waters that Leviathan plays in, but more likely, I think this means Leviathan who you, God, created this Leviathan to play with him. Now, just for a minute, let's step back. The Leviathan is a sea monster. The Leviathan is one of the forces traditionally that is a threat to God's establishing the world and undoing chaos. Okay? That is, if you were educated in a day school, at some point your teacher told you that at the end of times, the tzaddikim, the righteous people, would eat the Leviathan, eat the Leviathan that God would slay for them. Here, strikingly, the Leviathan is God's toy. The Bible scholar John Levinson quotes one of his students who said in class, for this psalm, the Leviathan is just a rubber ducky, right? He's the opposite of a chaotic force. He is the opposite of a threat to God's power. He's a little toy God is playing with. Robert Alter refers to this as a tame aquatic pet. Now, the point, though, I think, if we kind of leave Leviathan in particular for a moment, is that God utterly delights in creation. God has fashioned even the most usually terrifying creatures as sources of God's own delight. God takes pleasure in the world. Takes great pleasure in the world. We'll see how important that is in just a moment. By the way, I would also add that I think the very fact that the Leviathan is described as hanging out in the same sea as the ships is just another indication of just how tamed he has become, how much not a threat. I'm going to go, take a little boat ride, and who's going to beat the Leviathan? No big deal. That would be unimaginable in certain other Psalms, Psalm 74. So I think it's actually quite important notion here. Now, the verse 27 to 30 are really striking as descriptions of how God continues to engage providentially with the world. And there's a couple points here that are worth making. Bachi, if you can get 27 to the top and let people see that this whole unit, that would be great. Thank you. So, first of all, most of you are familiar from Psalm 145, Ashrei, that kol elecha yisaberun, everyone looks to you to give them food. There refers to humans. Here, it refers to kulam bechokhma asita. All of the creatures that you made look to you. And in verse 30, Genesis 2 says that God sends God's ruach to bring the human being to life. But in verse 30, God sends God's ruach to give life to all of God's creatures. Okay? And there is, I would suggest here, really a certain kind of tenderness in this picture. The image of God feeding the animals by hand. Verse 28, Titein lahem yilkotun, tiftach yadcha yisbeun tov. You open your hand and you feed them so they are well satisfied. Every creature, whether human or not, depends on God, who tenderly provides it with sustenance. Okay? And then, as I kind of already alluded to, God provides in verses 29 and 30 not only food, but the breath of life. And the emphasis here, I think, is important, which is that creation for this psalm is not something God did and then rested, but is something ongoing that God is engaged in. The world is moment by moment dependent on God, dependent on God's life-giving, on God's sustenance. In verse 31, you have this kind of interesting shift. Yehi chavod Adonai le'olam, yismach Adonai b'ma'asav. I think you can say, this is something I'm not 100% confident in saying, but I think you can say that this verse is a little surprising in that usually it is creation that rejoices in or before God. Here, it's the reverse. God rejoices in God's creation. Yismach Adonai b'ma'asav. May God rejoice, or even I think perhaps you can say even here delight in God's creation. And then in verse 33, actually, let's actually go to 34 in the interest of some time. Ye'erav alav sichi, anochi esmach b'Hashem. May my prayer be pleasing to God. I will rejoice in God. Now, the verb arev, to be pleasing, is reminiscent of what we more often hear said about sacrifices. This poem is the poet's sacrifice to God. He hopes that it may be found pleasing. The psalm itself is a gift that is intended to bring pleasure to God, just as the world as a whole does. My friend Richard Middleton, very astute Bible scholar, makes an interesting comment about this psalm in this context. He says that one of the fascinating aspects of human power in this psalm is rooted in the fact that the psalm is a work of distinctively human poesis. In other words, it is humans and humans alone who can articulate the point of view that humans are simply one among the many sorts of creatures in God's world, thus proving that they in fact are not. Right? That's the paradox. Only humans can try to demote themselves in their own poetic writing, which I think is a very interesting paradox that we find at the heart of this text. The psalm ends with a verse that I think strikes many, if not most readers at first as jarring. Think about it like this. We've seen 34 verses of wholeness, of fullness, of a sense of ecological interweaving that is healthy and robust, that flourishes, that is fed by God. And then all of a sudden we hear this. Yitamu chata'im min haaretz, u'resha'im odeinam. Let's just leave that. Let's just focus on that, right? May sinners disappear from the earth, and may the wicked be no more. Now, what is going on here? Why does a psalm of the type that we've just seen end in this way? And I think what you have here is the yearning of the psalmist to let no one at all interfere with the operation of the world as God intends the world to operate. Right? There is a sense in which this is perfect, but it can easily be undone. The ecological harmony that God has created here can be, can be taken apart. Let no one do that. The Rishaim and the Chataim, I think, here are people who threaten this picture. Who threaten this picture? By the way, I should say for some people who know this verse mainly from the Talmud, that the famous comment of Bruria notwithstanding, Chataim does not mean sins in this verse; it means sinners. Right? It is not the case that this is a prayer for sins to disappear. It's a prayer for sinners to disappear, and Chataim and Rishaim here are parallels to each other. One of the things that I love about Bruria's famous reading in the Talmud that it means that it refers to sins and not to sinners is that it's a deliberately creative misreading of only half a verse. Right? It's in other words, she quotes only the first part and she deliberately misreads it, which is gorgeous, but it's not what the verse itself originally meant. Now, so let me say just a couple more things here. First of all, this notion of praying at the end that sinners not get in the way. William Brown makes the observation here that maybe the confession underlying the end of this psalm is to say that humans, rather than sea monsters, are the real purveyors of chaos in the world. Humans, rather than chaos. I'm sorry, humans, rather than sea monsters, are the real purveyors of chaos. It is humans, and arguably humans alone, who have so much power that they can undo creation's healthy functioning. Leviathan can't do that, but you and I can. That, by the way, is a psalm for the 21st century. right? Leviathan cannot do the good order of God's creation, but you and I can. And what Brown points out is that without this verse, the psalm could be dismissed as something that's just kind of romantic, roseate. And this verse offers what he calls a brutal reality check. Now, my last comment about this, and then I want to give the floor to Shira. The psalm ends with again saying, Barchi nafshi et Hashem, hallelujah, a classic inclusio, an envelope. It repeats the opening phrase. But now, I think, the phrase can be heard with a different degree of power and richness. Why should the self praise God? Because God steadfastly sustains and renews creation each day. Because the world is in God's hand and God's hand tenderly nourishes it. The thing that I want to leave you with, to sort of just reflect upon, I think that's really striking here, is that you have here an unapologetic focus on God as the creator, without any mention of the God who acts in history, who brings salvation in historical contexts. There is a much more immediate experience of God's closeness in creation, in the experience of createdness and dependence. And there's something there that I think is very beautiful and powerful. And in an age when reaching for a God of history can be difficult, perhaps a God who underlies the breath of every creature, who makes the possibility of every creature being nurtured and sustained, perhaps there is God to be found in that very place. Much more to be said, but in the interest of time and handing over the floor, I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you, Shai. That was beautiful. And I'll pick up on many of those strands, actually, or some of those strands as we continue. There's so much to say about this Mizmor. I wanted to, before I speak more words, actually share a continuation of a bit of music. If you see now, just one moment, and this will be our entry point into part 2. So everyone, 30 seconds. We'll just listen to a continuation here. Sorry, did you hear that? Yes? Okay, good.
נוטה שמיים קריח, דם קרה במים עליותיו, בסמבים רכובו, המהלך על כנפי רוח, עושה מלאכיו רוחות, משרתיו ואש לוהט, יסד ארץ על מכוניה,
There's much more power to the end of that Mizmor, but I did want to open with music for the second piece, second part of this, because in so many ways, music is a natural entry point into this parak. And what we're going to look at here is what are the entry points into the different prakim of Tanakh as a whole, and the different entry points that humans can take into the prakim, the chapters of Tehillim, of Psalms in particular. Music, of course, is a very natural entry point to Psalms. And I think we do a lot of talking about and intellectualizing and reading, which I love, and it's my home place. But we have to, at points, stand back and let the song within us, both in times of hope and need and rejoicing and celebration, come to the fore. And in many ways, this is what 929 and the project is about. What is the entry point into a particular text? What is the entry point into a particular parak? We read a parak in front of us and we can step back and say, well, what grabs you? And I'm so grateful for that overview that Rav Shai gave us today, because I'll be picking up on some of the threads. But we can kind of look at each one of those psukim, individual units, and say, what grabs you? What draws you in? What's your point of entry into the text, given where you are now, given where you have come from, given where you have been in the past, where you hope to go, where you will be. And this is a very poignant and resonant chapter for that. And so part of our project, and I'm going to share my screen now and share the work of others. Hold on one moment. Oh, why am I not getting that? Okay, sorry about that. Is to look at the different entry points. And so what we'll do in this part is just kind of spend a few moments together looking at what are the different entry points in particular into this parak. And so what I have up here is page 104, right? Psalm 104, Tehillim Parak Kuf Daled, that you all got today earlier. And we obviously don't have time to go through all of these reflections, but there are different entry points. And we've invited, as part of the 929 project, on every chapter of Tanakh, and we have about over 7,000 new pieces of content on Tanakh. And on this chapter, about 20 pieces, reflecting on different entry points. The entry point might be musical entry point. That's what speaks to a person to kind of get into this parak. There are dramatic readings on the page today. There are musical renditions. Different days have different configurations of people speaking and singing. There's not just Jewish music. There is actually, right, we have a piece from Rachmaninoff here reflecting on this parak. Ron Weidberg, as you see here, is a professor at Kiryat Ono, professor of musicology. And so music is that natural place to enter into a chapter of Tanakh, particularly this chapter. I think also there is the visual piece, which is a very resonant piece in this parak, right? How do we conceive of the visual, of the power of the imagery here? There's a lot of imagery in this parak. It's very powerful. It evokes so many different images. And we have a number of different artists and different perspectives on what images you would pull out of this parak. Now, for me, as someone who's, an amateur photographer, it's quite interesting to see that in the advent, in the age of photography, where you can capture an image, this parak requires language to create those images. And once we have sort of photography as a power at our fingertips, have we lost something about using language to craft the power of the visual, the water, the animals, the ecosystems, the symbiosis, the natural relationship of the world, the beauty, the wonder, the richness, the scariness, the boundedness, right? We'll pick up on some of those themes in just a moment. But how can we rely upon our words as opposed to, right? Today we rely upon capturing in an image. Well, have we perhaps lost something when we capture in an image? There is, of course, the poetic entry point. Many people have taken, right, a poem and it has inspired them to write another poem. I'll just kind of pop up one here. We have on one particular pasuk, we have a writer. It's called, Haiku Yomi, on every day of Tanakh and every day of Tehillim. Yoni Dogan is an entrepreneur in Tel Aviv, but in his side gig, pulls one pasuk and then writes his own haiku. So on pasuk 35, right? Lamed Hey, Shira Ladonai b'chayai, Zamra Elohai be'odi, U'sha'im od einam barchi nafshi et Adonai, hallelujah. His haiku, just a drop of good, sparks songs of joy rising up, shattered vessels heal. And so what we have when we take this parak is there's poetry and poetry that allows for other poetry. There are a number of your original poems on the site on this day. Yaakov Azriel, Guy Bernstein, who are taking inspiration from the poets of old, the psalmist, to enable them to create and craft new poetry. There's an entry point that is the comparative. And we'll see a number of writers on the site here and drawing on scholarship that is also on the site. And some of our scholars who are on today, Professor Adele Berlin, I think was, I saw your name here. We're very grateful that you're here. The question of the comparative entry points, the inner biblical comparative analysis. I know that, today, Tammy Jacobowitz and Zoe Furtick, Moshe Sokolow have used that sort of comparative approach, looking at interbiblical stories and comparing Genesis 1 with Psalm 104. What is the inspiration? How can we read these narratives? How can we read this poetry vis-a-vis the narrative and bring to light the different multiple perspectives? The comparative piece may also be from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So I know I'm scrolling through a lot, but you've got it all in front of you. We have the comparative piece. Where is it? To the great hymn of Akhenaten, an ancient Egyptian poem, composed. We have relics in 1353 around BCE. We have Akhenaten writing a hymn to the sun god Aten. And there are many similarities between Psalm 104. Perhaps the poem, the great hymn to Aten, was a precursor, but the comparative analysis is a way to enter into the text. And there is also the personal, and that's where I kind of want to draw my perspective. The personal, the experiential. Now, the personal might take a number of different approaches. The personal, as we see, some people have written on the site today. We have Shoshana Michael Zucker wrote about bread baking, an illusion alluded to in this parak, the sustenance of humans as bread. But what does that say to my own experience of baking bread, right? Leah Sarna quotes the Talmud and talks about the Leviathan as a playmate of God, and talks about that model of a well-balanced life and the importance of play, right? This invites us to take our own experiences into the text and bring them to the fore, anchored and grounded in particular psukim, in particular analysis, but kind of bringing individual experiences to the fore. And so what I wanted to focus on in the short time that we have is the experiential, right? What is the perspective of the psalmist here? So many, and I'll stop the share for just a moment before we get the text back up. Many scholars have pointed out, Professor Alter, Professor Berlin, that this chapter, as we said, reflects not on creation as it happened, but how we as humans are to perceive it, how we are to experience it, how we are to feel it, how we are to then craft it in our own perspective and in our own view. I think it's very interesting to note that Professor Berlin points out that the topic of creation actually almost never is an end in and of itself in Psalms. It's always a trope or a sub-theme that supports a Psalm's main theme. And yet this parak Kuf Daled 104, seems to break that rule, because as many read it, its main topic really is creation. And yet it's a retelling of creation. It's creation from a very, very particular kind of perspective. We have in Genesis 1, God's eye, right? And the perspective of God. And Psalm 104 is what a person on earth would see, right? We're looking at the world, we're looking at creation through human eyes at a very particular moment with a very particular angle. It's a world that exists in real time for the psalmist. And I want to pick up on that dimension because we're really given kind of an opportunity for a very intimate experience with the text. And we can kind of ask ourselves, when we think of it that way, where is the author, where is the psalmist looking from? Right? What is the perspective? Sort of opened with those different perspectives. There is the artistic, the visual, the music, the comparative, the ideological, right? We didn't even talk about that, right? There are many pieces on the site today where we talk about environmentalism and the symbiosis of the ecosystem, the animal rights, right? There are different multiple perspectives. So I kind of want to stand back and say, where is the psalmist sort of standing, so to speak? And just so that we can frame that, there are some mizmorim, there are some psalms where it's very clear what the perspective is. So for example, Psalm 29, Hecht, is the perspective of someone standing on the mountains of Lebanon, looking at the sea and looking at the storm. It's clear when you read that mizmor that is what the perspective is. But in Kuf Daled, so we can ask the question, where physically, and perhaps I want to reflect on more so emotionally is this person standing, right? What's the setting that strings together the different elements, many of which we just saw with Rabbi Shai, those different structural elements, poetic elements, existential, theological, natural elements, but what's kind of the overall frame and setting and perspective that strings together those different elements of this mizmor? What perhaps we might say is the experience that gives rise to this type of poetry? I think that allows for a very individualized perspective, a way of putting yourself in the text by looking at the psalmist and saying, what is their perspective? And here I'd like to offer a particular motif, and Rav Shai touched upon it, and I'm glad that you did, and I'll develop it a bit more, that there are two elements to focus on that resonate in particular for me. And they're perhaps two sides of the same coin. One is the motif of God putting up borders for protection, right? We saw that a bit with the water, and we'll see it in another couple of examples, but the idea that there's borders, there's protection. There are forces that could have gone out of control and they're not. And the flip of that is that we're offered the perspective of a person living life and perhaps reflecting on all of the things that could have been scary, right? Potentially could have gone wrong, could have gone out of control, and yet they don't, they haven't. And so I want to look at that in three different examples to develop that theme. I'll share the screen again so that you can see the parak. Hang on 1 second, let me just make it a bit bigger. The first where we see that motif, the boundedness, is in the context of water, right, which we talked about here. So I'm not going to read those psukim, I'll just paraphrase, but really verses 6 through 9, psukim vav through tet are up on the screen for you. But we have the image here of that powerful force of water. It could have, and it actually has in the past, taken over the world, but it's held back. God doesn't allow it, right? The waters stand above the mountains. They're kind of, when you think of the imagery, and I'm a person of images and art, you see the water waiting, right? They fled at your blast. They rushed away at the sound of thunder, yet there are bounds that they don't pass so that they can never again cover the earth. And Professor Alter has an interesting explanation here, references to Noah, perhaps on the flood, but that sense that water is powerful, but contained. It satiates, it irrigates, it gives the trees and the grass what to drink, and it potentially could overpower, but it doesn't. And that's the imagery that we get here. It doesn't overrun. The waves never win. The land always pushes back. And if that weren't the case, we wouldn't survive. So we see in the context of water, that sense of boundedness. Similarly, and again, I'm glad we had a chance to look at this, in Psukim Chaf through Chaf Gimel, verses 20 through 23, we have the lions, right? I just went to the Central Park Zoo with my kids. We saw the snow leopards, the lions, and there is this sense of like, you can tear me apart. And we see here this powerful force that could potentially overtake us, yet it doesn't. And we have the image here of the nocturnal animals and the description of God making the moon in verse 20. You bring on darkness, it is night when all of the beasts of the forest stir. These are nocturnal animals. And yet, verse 22, but when the sun rises, they come home. And then verse 23, man goes out to his work, to his labor until the evening. Right? The lions are out at night, they're hunting, but they're nocturnal, and there are set times for everything. They don't attack me when I get up. When I wake up, they go to sleep, and it works, right? We can live together. Things are not catastrophic as they potentially could be. We have this holistic portrayal, the harmonious ecosystem. We can live side by side. The dangers are there. They're there in this mizmor throughout, but they're latent. They're held back. They're all in check. And similarly, the Leviathan, as we talked about, right? The Leviathan. We have an image of this great sea creature in verses 25 through 28. It's strong, it's scary, but in many ways it's defanged. as you noted, Rav Shai, right? It's defanged in a way here. It's less scary than any other references in biblical and also extra biblical literature. It's a playmate, right? And you can read more about that in Leah's piece on the site today. It's formed as a playmate for God. And ultimately, the psalmist says, the Leviathan is going to look to you, God, for food, just like every creature on the earth looks to you for food. It's not so scary anymore when it's depicted as vulnerable and reliant on God in the same way that you and I are, right? It's not such a scary creature suddenly. And so ultimately what we see here is God's will holding back the dangers and a particular boundedness, right? It's not that things are super peaceful, but it's that things are in checked. They're checked, they're balanced. They potentially could be catastrophic, but they're not. There's powerful raging water, there's fierce lions, there's mythical sea creatures. And I think it's important, they add drama, they add energy, they add color, they add movement, they add forcefulness, they add rigor, they add dynamism to the world. But they need to be held back. They need to be in check. And that's what God does. And that's what the psalmist is praising God for in this Mizmor, right? That's the perspective, I would argue, that is being taken here. Now, the flip side of the beauty is the danger. They go hand in hand. Things that are beautiful are often dangerous. And we see that in this parak. We see the sense that what's so captivating about the ocean raging is that it can wipe me out in a moment. That's what makes it beautiful. That's what makes it energetic. That's what makes it forceful. And yet it doesn't, right? God holds back the fierceness and the potential catastrophe of all the danger that's inherent in the world. And so when I think about this Mizmor, there's so much to unpack here. But when I think about this Mizmor, where the psalmist is coming from, right? Thinking about the magnitude of forces in the world, how scary they could be, and sort of considering a place of all that could have gone wrong, but actually in the natural cycle doesn't go wrong. I kind of wonder about the moment that we're in, right? And I leave it and I think together, and hopefully we'll think together for a moment or two as a point of reflection to think about this moment that we're experiencing. I can't read Tehillim right now without the shadow of the pandemic looming above it all. And in particular, this parak. Right? Because on some level, it really feels like, no, the scary forces in the world that I just argued and said, well, you look at these three categories. And what the psalmist is saying here is that they didn't overtake the world. They were held back. They were in check. So on some level, when I think about the moment that we're in and I read this parak, it really feels like the scary forces in the world actually were not held back at this moment, right? And I don't know, would the author be able to write and reflect in the same way at this very moment? I'm not really sure. Yet on the other hand, we're kind of entering a road of recovery, vaccine rollout, containment in some way. We might perhaps look at this moment from a bird's eye view, a zoomed out perspective, and be able to offer that same sentiments of gratitude, the poem of gratitude, that the world and things in the world at this moment, as bad and horrific and as painful as they actually are perhaps not as bad as they could have been. You look at the forces, the energy that brings with it in many ways beauty, right, and interest and intrigue. It could have been a lot worse. Now, this is not to say that every Mizmor of Tehillim can and should connect to a particular moment. But I think in this world, in our moment, it's in a world that's been disrupted and disordered by chaos. And we talked about that primordial force of chaos. And in a world that's disrupted by chaos of the global pandemic, we can look to Tehillim for confidence, for comforts, that the forces actually at the end of the day are going to be held back. They are being held back. That's what we're praising God for here in the different dimensions, both in the natural, like the animal kingdom, and the forces of the water and the sea creatures. We see that they're held back. And so, I'm uncertain. I'm uncertain about how we would look at this parak, right, in a particular moment. But in many ways, when I hope to take a measure of comfort from looking at this parak in light of the moments and the scarier elements of the world, which can be reframed and situate us in a position of comfort, appreciation. I wouldn't say beauty, although this parak really says these things are beautiful. They're wondrous. They're forceful and they're scary, but they're also wondrous. In our moment, I can't yet say that it's beautiful, but there is that element of what is the perspective that the psalmist is looking at. And I think this really invites, I know we just have a couple of minutes left together. I wish we had a lot more time to, to discuss and to unpack, but I think just zooming back and looking at all the different ways that we can find ourselves in the text, so often it's hard to find an individual perspective. And this I got, from my years of teaching high school in a classroom, there was this sense of, here's a text, here's what everyone else had to say about it. I'm going to situate myself in the context of what they had to say. And I often sort of started a new narrative and said, write something about it from your perspective. You are now Dinah in the story of the rape of Dinah. Write a diary entry. You are a slave in Egypt. Get in there with your eyes and your mind. And that's actually an exercise that we need to teach ourselves. How do we implant ourselves into a particular text that's coming from a very particular perspective that has, millennia of interpretation coming with it, and we inherit that, and there's a great blessing that we inherit that with. And yet it's an art and it's an exercise to say, where can you find yourself in that text? What is your perspective? Maybe it's using the psalmist perspective, and maybe it's rejecting that entirely and saying, well, here's my entry point. And the 929 Project in many ways is about that. Right? We have many thinkers, scholars, educators, leaders, lay people, professionals, artists, musicians saying, here's what I have to say. I know, it's unique. It's not unique. It's building upon the thinking of others. But the goal is to take a chapter, is to take a parak, is to take the text and say, how can I make it my own? And my own might be building on something to help cultivate what's coming from within, or it might be radically taking down and reinterpreting in many different ways. But I hope that this kind of invites us to do that exercise. I want to be very mindful of time. I know that it's late for some of us, and it's just a minute before 9, but Rav Shai, I want to offer, much gratitude and blessing and perhaps a closing thought on this parak as we tie things up.
You were asking me for a closing thought? Is that what you're? Yes.
Or just, a thought on the perspective. If you.
Yeah. No, I wasn't sure what you meant. Yeah. The thought that I have about this psalm that I've been thinking about a little bit in the last few minutes is, can we find ourselves inhabiting a world in which praising God is our first and most effective way of responding to the ecological crisis we find ourselves in? Is the reorientation of our lives made possible by an orientation of praise possibly what we need in order to transform the human heart in this moment? Right? Because praise is all about decentering the self. And maybe that's on some level what we need more urgently than anything else is new, old, new ways of decentering our own egos. And praise is a very powerful, potentially, way to do just that. That's my not fully cooked thought to end with.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Shai. Thank you, everyone, for coming to learn with us. I hope we just gave you a taste. I know this was, a shared platform in a short amount of time for a parak that can have hours and hours of endless interpretation. We invite you to join both reading all of the reflections. That's why I feel committed to saying, right, there are many more. Click on each one of those links, and you have them in the email that you registered with today to kind of read the alternate perspectives, and to continue learning in Project Zug's next cycle as they do Tehillim. Once again, I know there are some other courses that are being rolled out, but we are grateful for everyone for joining us tonight and very much look forward to more learning opportunities, joint learning opportunities together. We'll a little bit more time so that we can unpack together. But we invite you really to find yourselves in the text, in whatever entry point that might be. And there are many, many, to look at a text, step back and say, where am I? What can I offer this text? So everyone should stay well, be healthy, continue learning. And thank you all so much for coming tonight.